In November of 1940, a baby boy was born inside a hospital in San Francisco's Chinatown. His name was Li Jun Fan, though the world would come to know him differently. His father, Li Hoi Chuen, was a well-regarded Cantonese opera actor. His mother, Grace Ho, came from a family of mixed Chinese and Eurasian heritage. They had traveled from Hong Kong to the United States as part of a performance tour. Their son arrived during that journey, far from home and far from the city where he would later be raised. The hospital where he was born stood on a quiet street, tucked between lantern-lit storefronts and corner cafes. Outside, the world felt unsettled. The war in Europe was escalating. The Pacific felt tense. Yet inside that modest building, time moved more softly. The newborn's cries were sharp but brief. A nurse wrapped him in cloth and placed him in his mother's arms. There was a Chinese tradition of aligning birth with the zodiac calendar. Bruce was born in the year of the dragon, in the hour of the dragon. That detail, while symbolic, would linger in stories about him for years to come. At the time, he was simply a newborn, one of many children born that month, to parents carrying hopes bigger than the rooms they lived in. Within a few months, the Li family returned to Hong Kong. The city was familiar to them, a place where their extended family lived, and where Bruce's father had a career on stage and in film. The transition back to life in Kowloon was not seamless. Political tensions were rising. The city would soon fall under Japanese occupation, altering life for nearly every family. Bruce was still an infant when the Japanese army arrived. Those early years during wartime left a quiet mark. Food was scarce. Daily routines were shaped by uncertainty. Bruce's family, like many others, found ways to adapt. They leaned on extended family and the comfort of familiar rituals. Opera remained a central thread in their household. Performers would gather. Lines would be rehearsed. Costumes hung near open windows, swaying slightly in the breeze. Bruce's earliest memories likely formed after the war ended. By then, he was growing quickly. He had an older brother and sister, and soon, more siblings would follow. The Li household was full but close-knit. Family meals were a mix of simple Cantonese dishes and quiet conversation. On weekends, there were strolls to markets, visits with relatives, and occasional glimpses into his father's working world. Bruce's father remained a steady presence. His career as an opera performer gave him a disciplined air, but at home, he was measured and warm. His mother, Grace, offered a different kind of presence. Watchful, gentle, yet firm when needed. Together, they guided their children with a balance of freedom and expectation. As Bruce entered early childhood, one thing became clear. He was not a quiet child. He was observant, certainly, and curious in ways that surprised adults. But he was also energetic. He moved constantly. Even in still moments, his mind seemed to be reaching outward, watching, questioning, absorbing what the world was offering. Though his formal education had not yet begun, Bruce was already learning in ways that would shape his future. He watched his father perform, not just on stage, but in conversation, with neighbors, with family, with strangers. He learned how words carried weight. He noticed how movement could silence a room. These early observations would linger, quiet, but lasting. Before long, Bruce would step into that world himself, not as a student, but as a participant. He was only a child, but he was already beginning to move toward the center of the frame. Bruce's entry into film came naturally. He was still a toddler when he appeared in his first movie. The role was minor, a child part in a local Cantonese production, but it set a precedent. He was comfortable in front of the camera. The director noted his ease and lack of self-consciousness. From then on, casting agents began to remember his name. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, Bruce continued to act in Hong Kong cinema. He appeared in more than a dozen films by the time he was a teenager. These roles were usually small, but frequent. His face became familiar to regular moviegoers, even if he wasn't yet a lead. His confidence on screen grew with each role. He learned how to read scripts, take direction, and adjust to the rhythm of a film set. But Bruce's life was not confined to movie studios. He lived in a part of Kowloon where narrow streets curved between markets and small apartment buildings. The sounds of the city were layered. Vendors shouting prices, radios spilling music into alleyways, and children calling to each other as they played games near stairwells. Bruce was one of those children. He had friends in nearly every building. He also had a reputation for mischief. His energy often spilled into defiance. He challenged authority, questioned rules, and got into trouble often enough for teachers and neighbors to remember him. The discipline of filmmaking didn't seem to carry over to the classroom. He was restless in school. Sitting still was difficult. He asked questions not to be difficult, but because he was genuinely curious and easily bored. By the time he reached adolescence, Bruce's presence in the neighborhood had shifted. He was no longer just an energetic boy. He had become known for his fists. Street fights were common in post-war Hong Kong, especially among teenage boys trying to assert control in a crowded, uncertain environment. But Bruce didn't go looking for trouble, but he rarely walked away from it either. Some of the fights were brief, just a few quick blows traded in a stairwell or alley. Others were more serious. Bruce developed a reputation. Some admired his skill. Others avoided confrontation altogether. At home, his parents grew concerned. They saw the direction his energy was taking and began to look for something that could redirect it. That redirection would come not from film or school, but from martial arts. Bruce was around 13 when his father introduced him to Wing Chun. It wasn't a grand moment, no ceremony or bold declaration. It was more of a quiet shift. After yet another street fight, Bruce's parents had decided he needed a disciplined outlet. His father knew someone who could help. That someone was IP Man. At the time, IP Man wasn't widely known outside martial arts circles. He taught quietly, away from the spotlight, with a focus on subtle technique and internal balance. His students trained in tight rooms, often at night. Bruce joined one of those small groups. And though he was younger and less experienced than some of the others, he showed promise almost immediately. Wing Chun was built on close-range combat, fast hands, and center-line control. It required awareness, timing, and patience, qualities Bruce didn't fully have yet, but began to develop. At first, he struggled with the stillness the form required. He wanted to move quickly, to overpower, to show strength through speed. But Wing Chun wasn't about aggression. It was about understanding. Ip Man's style was calm and precise. He didn't lecture often. He demonstrated. He allowed students to discover the form through repetition and subtle correction. Bruce responded to this approach. Slowly, the techniques began to shape him. Not just physically, but mentally. His movements became sharper. His posture shifted. He paid closer attention to breath, balance, and spacing. Still, he remained a teenager. The discipline didn't transform him overnight. Outside of training, he remained spirited and unpredictable. He danced competitively, learned cha-cha, and even taught it to others. He loved American culture, admired James Dean, and experimented with different hairstyles and clothes. But something had begun to settle within him. He now had a vocabulary for his energy, a way to focus it. His reputation continued to grow, both in the neighborhood and in the martial arts community. He still fought, but those fights became more measured. He wasn't reckless. He was deliberate. Yet, as he neared adulthood, tension returned. His name was becoming too familiar in police circles. Some of his fights had escalated beyond what the community could tolerate. One in particular brought serious consequences. Fearing for his future, Bruce's parents made a decision. At 18, he would leave Hong Kong and return to the country of his birth. America was distant, unknown, but filled with possibility. He had relatives in Seattle. There, he could study, work, and find something different. Bruce didn't protest. He understood what was at stake. His life in Hong Kong had become too narrow, too charged. He needed space, room to move and think. As he packed his things, he wasn't saying goodbye to home forever. But something in him knew this wasn't just a trip. It was a departure. And with a one-way ticket and a modest suitcase, Bruce stepped onto a ship bound for San Francisco once more. Not as a newborn this time, but as a young man with calloused knuckles, sharp eyes, and a sense that his story was only just beginning. Bruce's early teen years in Hong Kong were layered with contradiction. By day, he attended the La Salle College, a well-regarded secondary school founded by Christian brothers. By night, he drifted through a very different world, one where sharp words and faster fists often carried more weight than grades or uniforms. It was during this time that martial arts became more than an outlet. It became a frame through which he began to view himself. Training with a IP man was informal and often inconsistent. Bruce's impulsive nature sometimes put him at odds with other students. There were periods when he stopped attending altogether, either because of personal clashes or distractions elsewhere. But the style of Wing Chun stayed with him. Its structure, logic, and economy of motion left a lasting impression. Wing Chun wasn't about brute force. It taught him how to redirect energy, how to conserve motion, how to remain still while waiting for the right opening. That approach contrasted with the chaos he often saw in the streets. It gave him a rhythm to follow. At the same time, Bruce's physical talents began to branch outward. He wasn't just a fighter. He became a dancer. Cha, of all things, captured his interest. Not casually, but competitively. He practiced intensely, often rehearsing routines for hours at a time. In 1958, he won the Hong Kong Cha-Cha Championship. The discipline, balance, and awareness needed in dance mirrored what he was learning in martial arts. Each step, each pivot, each controlled shift of weight reinforced his growing body awareness. He was developing more than skill. He was developing presence. This time in his life was full of momentum. Moved constantly, through neighborhoods, through groups of friends, through thoughts and ambitions. Yet beneath that movement, a quiet conflict remained. He was becoming someone, restless, sharp, promising. But he didn't yet know what that meant, or where it might lead. Bruce wasn't a large teenager. By most accounts, he was slight, wiry, quick, and deceptively strong. But what stood out more than his frame was the way he carried it. Even before stepping into a stance, his presence suggested readiness. By the time he reached 15, the line between training and real-world application had begun to blur. Street fights were not rare in 1950s Hong Kong, especially among young men caught between social layers. The British colonial presence governed institutions and policies, but most Chinese locals lived in crowded districts where rules were unevenly enforced. For boys like Bruce, the city became a kind of stage. There were rival groups, unspoken hierarchies. Unspoken hierarchies. Moments where being slow to react could leave a mark that lasted far longer than a bruise. Bruce didn't seek out violence recklessly, but he didn't walk away from challenge either. He tested himself against others, against rules, sometimes even against teachers or elders who underestimated him. These encounters weren't only physical, they were also psychological. He was beginning to think more deeply about strength, what it meant to resist, to adapt, to endure. At home, these changes were visible. His parents saw him growing more independent, more stubborn. He wasn't defiant without reason, but he questioned most forms of authority. He wanted to understand things for himself. He began practicing in private more often, not just Wing Chun forms, but his own variations, experiments in rhythm, spacing, footwork. His room became a kind of miniature studio. He would watch his own movements in the mirror, adjusting, refining, correcting. He studied American magazines. He followed film actors, especially those who moved with deliberate control, boxers, dancers, and action stars alike. The West fascinated him, not because it was foreign, but because it seemed to represent something direct, open, and forceful. Yet Bruce was still deeply shaped by Hong Kong. The noise, the speed, the layered culture of Cantonese tradition and post-war ambition gave him his edge. The city was dense with contrast. And Bruce, even as a teenager, was learning to hold two things at once: the inner stillness of form and the outer flow of constant motion. By the time Bruce reached 18, the energy that had once made him memorable was beginning to make him a concern. His street fights were no longer dismissed as teenage restlessness. They were drawing police attention. He had crossed a line in one confrontation. A serious altercation that ended with legal warnings and the looming threat of formal charges. Bruce's father, Li Huishuen, knew that something had to change. The family had means, but not influence enough to protect their son from the consequences of his growing reputation. More than that, he sensed the limits of Hong Kong. The city had shaped Bruce, but it was no longer offering him space to grow. The decision to send Bruce to America came quickly, but not without thought. He had been born in San Francisco, which meant he held American citizenship. A cousin lived in Seattle and was willing to help him settle there. It wasn't framed as exile, but everyone understood the subtext. Bruce accepted the decision. Perhaps part of him was relieved. He was restless again, and life in Hong Kong had become tense and narrow. He said his goodbyes with a sense of gravity. Friends, fellow students, even old sparring partners came to see him off. The departure wasn't dramatic, but it carried quiet weight. He packed lightly: some clothes, a few books, a small amount of money. Enough to get started, but barely more. The ship that carried him across the Pacific was slow-moving and spare. The journey took weeks. He spent much of the time alone, writing letters, sketching ideas in notebooks, staring out at the flat line where sky touched sea. In those days of quiet travel, Bruce had time to think, not about what he had left behind, but about what he might become. He was no longer a child, but he wasn't yet what he imagined either. He had glimpsed the power of form. He had tested his body and his will. He had felt the tension between control and chaos. Now, he was heading toward a new world. one that didn't know him, one where he would have to begin again. And for the first time in years, he wasn't stepping onto a film set or into a fight. He was stepping into the unknown. In the spring of 1959, Bruce stepped off a ship in Seattle. The air was cooler than what he was used to. The city felt quieter. Too spread out. Slower, softer at the edges. He arrived with less than $100 in his pocket and the address of a friend of his father's who had agreed to help him settle in. For the first time, Bruce was alone. Not in the sense of isolation, but in responsibility. Everything now depended on him. His meals, his shelter, his direction. He enrolled at Edison Technical School, a vocational institution that offered courses in English and general education. His primary goal was to finish high school and improve his grasp of the language. To earn money, he took odd jobs. He worked part-time at a restaurant owned by Ruby Chow, a friend of the family, and a well-known figure in Seattle's Chinese community. Bruce lived in a room above the restaurant and helped out downstairs in exchange for rent. The arrangement was modest, but it gave him stability. During the day, he studied. In the evenings, he trained. He didn't have formal equipment, so he improvised. A small corner of his room became a training space, with handwritten notes taped to the wall. He began teaching martial arts casually, first to friends, then to small groups in local parks or basements. Word spread quickly. Bruce's approach was unlike anything his early students had seen. He wasn't traditional. He didn't teach from a fixed curriculum. He adjusted his style to the individual. Some students were drawn to his physical precision. Others were captivated by his ability to explain movement, not just how it worked, but why. Bruce wasn't just repeating lessons he had learned in Hong Kong. He was already reshaping them. The Wing Chun foundation was there, but it was evolving, becoming something more open, more experimental. He named his early method Jun Fan Gung Fu, after his given name. It was a beginning, not a brand, but a statement of identity. In this quiet corner of Seattle, far from Hong Kong's tight alleys and noise, Bruce was planting the first seeds of something that would eventually change the world. As Bruce settled into life in Seattle, his world began to expand in unexpected ways. It wasn't just about building strength anymore. It was about understanding what strength meant. He enrolled at the University of Washington, choosing to major in philosophy. It surprised some of his friends. Martial artists weren't often associated with academic study. But for Bruce, it made sense. Philosophy mirrored what he was already doing in practice. It was a way of asking questions about self, form, time, intention. He read widely. Western thinkers like Descartes, Nietzsche, and William James. Eastern texts like the Tao Te Ching and writings from Zen Buddhism. These weren't abstract readings for him. He took them personally, looking for threads he could connect to movement, discipline, and expression. His notebooks from this time were filled with short reflections. Notes on posture, on breath, on resistance, and flow. He began shaping his own framework, not just for martial arts, but for living. Bruce's physical training continued to evolve alongside his studies. He incorporated techniques from boxing, fencing, wrestling, anything he felt offered practical value. He rejected rigid systems. He believed no single style had all the answers. What mattered most was adaptability, simplicity, directness. He started to refer to martial arts as the art of expressing the human body. That idea would stay with him for the rest of his life. His teaching practice also grew. What started as informal sessions in parks became more structured. He opened a small school near the university. Students from all backgrounds came. Asian, white, black. This diversity set him apart. Many traditional martial Art schools were closed to outsiders or stuck within cultural boundaries. Bruce taught anyone who showed real interest. That openness occasionally drew criticism from older martial artists. Some saw him as disrespectful or reckless. But Bruce wasn't trying to offend. He was trying to share what he found meaningful. Each student who walked through his door was another lens, another way for Bruce to test his ideas, refine his method, and challenge assumptions. By the early 1960s, he had become more than just a local instructor. He was a thinker in motion. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing clarity. Amid the discipline of training and the intensity of philosophical study, something softer began to take shape in Bruce's life. Her name was Linda Emery. They met at the University of Washington. Linda was studying to become a teacher. Bruce was teaching martial arts on the side. She signed up for one of his classes out of curiosity, unsure what to expect. What she found was someone who spoke not just with confidence, but with conviction. Someone who seemed deeply alive in the present moment. Their connection was gradual. They spoke often after class, sometimes for hours. Bruce was open with his ideas, unafraid to share his thoughts on balance, discipline, and culture. Linda admired his clarity. He admired her steadiness. As their relationship deepened, so did the challenges they faced. This was the early 1960s. Interracial relationships were still taboo in many parts of America. Friends and strangers alike sometimes offered opinions, some well-meaning, others less so. But Bruce and Linda moved forward. In 1964, they married in Seattle. The ceremony was quiet. Few people from Bruce's family could attend. But the moment was sincere, and the bond was strong. They rented a small apartment. Bruce continued teaching, and Linda supported his work while finishing her own studies. Money was tight, but neither of them seemed distracted by that. They were building something together, not just a marriage, but a shared sense of direction. That same year, Bruce participated in a martial arts demonstration at the Long Beach International Karate Championships in California. It was a significant turning point. His performance was electric, explosive speed, sharp technique, and undeniable charisma. In the crowd were martial artists, spectators, and a few Hollywood insiders. Among them was a man named Jay Sebring, a hairstylist with ties to the entertainment industry. He saw something in Bruce. Something beyond fighting. Soon after, Bruce was invited to meet a producer. The meeting didn't promise immediate roles or contracts, but it introduced him to a new world, one that stirred old memories from his childhood days on Hong Kong film sets. By the time their first child, Brandon, was born in 1965, Bruce's life had shifted again. He was still teaching, still studying, but he was also beginning to imagine something larger. A future where his ideas could move across screens, across languages, across cultures. He didn't yet have a plan, but the direction was forming. And in the quiet evenings of their small home with a baby in his arms and Linda beside him, Bruce Lee was no longer a stranger in America. He was a man with roots, both planted and reaching. By the mid-1960s, Bruce's work in martial arts had taken on a new rhythm. He wasn't just teaching techniques. He was shaping an evolving philosophy. The system he'd begun in Seattle, Jun Fan Gung Fu, became more refined with each passing year. It was never a fixed style. From the start, it reflected Bruce's belief in adaptability and honest self-expression. He opened a second school in Oakland, California, with his friend James Yim Lee. The Bay Area brought new energy. There were more students, more instructors, and more opportunities to test and challenge what Bruce was developing. He taught with intensity. Classes weren't long, but they were focused. He emphasized economy of motion, directness, and clarity. There was no room for ceremony. He stripped away unnecessary rituals, choosing instead to focus on what worked. His students trained hard, and they trained with purpose. Bruce wasn't interested in hierarchy. His school had no belts, no rigid ranks. What mattered to him was effort and understanding. He encouraged students to ask questions, to test ideas, and to refine their own approach. This mindset attracted a different kind of martial artist. Those who were curious, disciplined, and ready to think beyond tradition. Bruce challenged his students constantly. He sparred with them, demonstrated drills, broke down sequences frame by frame. His reputation continued to grow. Word of mouth brought in students from across the country. Some were seasoned fighters, others were beginners, but all of them sensed that Bruce was offering something rare. His own body became a laboratory. He tested new combinations, incorporated footwork from fencing, hand speed from boxing, and ideas from traditional Chinese and Japanese systems. He read widely, analyzed film, and documented everything. In this period, Bruce wasn't seeking approval. He was building quietly, working toward a vision that had not yet fully revealed itself. And with every class he taught, every adjustment he made, Jun Fan Gung Fu moved closer to what it was always meant to be, an art in constant motion. Bruce's personal life deepened in step with his expanding philosophy. His relationship with Linda became an anchor through long hours of training and teaching. They had married young, but their partnership matured quickly under the weight of real-world demands. Linda understood Bruce's intensity. She didn't try to soften it, nor did she step away from it. Instead, she created space for it. Quiet encouragement when he needed calm, honest dialogue when he needed grounding. Their home life wasn't elaborate, but it was steady. In 1965, their son Brandon was born. Bruce held him carefully, almost curiously at first. He was still in his 20s, still trying to shape his path. But holding his son gave him a different sense of time. Suddenly, there was a future that looked back at him. Becoming a father didn't slow Bruce down. If anything, it sharpened his focus. He now had more than a personal philosophy to build. He had a family to support and a legacy to consider. During this time, Bruce's writings became more structured. He began to record his training methods with greater detail. Notes, sketches, and personal reflections filled stacks of pages. He wrote not only about form and fighting, but also about awareness, ego, fear, and timing. His thoughts began moving towards something new, something beyond Jun Fan Gung Fu. He wanted to create a martial art that wasn't a style at all, one that had no fixed shape. He began using a new term to describe this evolving system: Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. This wasn't just branding. It was a philosophical step forward. Jeet Kune Do rejected formality, even as it demanded discipline. It wasn't about memorizing techniques, but about discovering personal truth through motion. Bruce didn't claim to have all the answers. Instead, he positioned himself as a student who had simply gone further down a path. He wanted others to walk it with him, not behind him, but beside him. The world hadn't yet caught up to what he was building. But in his home, in his classes, and in his journals, the future of martial arts was already being written. And through it all, Linda remained steady. Their life was not without strain, but it was built on shared belief. One rooted not just in love, but in purpose. By the late 1960s, Bruce's martial arts philosophy had grown beyond form. What began as a way to teach practical self-defense had become a method of personal inquiry. He no longer saw martial arts simply as a series of movements. To him, it had become a mirror, a way of revealing the self through action. His evolving philosophy often challenged the norms of the martial arts community. Traditional schools emphasized lineage and form. Bruce emphasized function and freedom. While others spoke of technique, he spoke of presence. He believed that the true enemy was not an opponent, but rigidity. Not just in fighting, but in thought. His goal was to help people strip away the unnecessary, to remove habits that didn't serve them, to move with clarity rather than conformity. This belief made its way into his writing and teaching. Absorb what is useful, discard what is not, add what is uniquely your own, he often said. It wasn't just a quote. It was the principle behind everything he taught. He held demonstrations across the country, sometimes at martial arts tournaments, sometimes at private gatherings. What he showed was always simple, fast, and precise. A trap here, a strike there. No wasted motion, no performance. Yet, Bruce was not a cold technician. His energy was sharp, but never harsh. He spoke about balance, not only in body, but in mind. He wanted his students to be prepared for conflict, but not drawn to it. He often used the metaphor of water. Be formless, he would say. Be fluid, adaptable. Water fits into any container. It can crash, or it can flow. In his mind, that was the highest level of martial understanding. To respond without hesitation. To live without tension. These ideas took root in the students closest to him. They didn't just memorize his drills. They carried his mindset. Each lesson with Bruce was a kind of meditation. Grounded, focused, alive. But even as his teaching deepened, Bruce felt the pull of another world. Hollywood had taken notice of his presence. There were whispers of auditions, meetings, and projects on the horizon. He didn't see this as a detour from martial arts. He saw it as a new way to share what he had learned. Because for Bruce, movement was never just physical. It was a kind of language. And through that language, he was ready to speak to the world. In 1966, Bruce Lee got a call that would bring him into the world of American television. He was cast as Kato, the sharp, silent chauffeur and sidekick in The Green Hornet. The show was modeled after a radio serial and followed a familiar formula: masked vigilantes fighting crime with cool cars and clever gadgets. But Bruce didn't blend quietly into the background. His presence was immediate. He moved differently than anyone American audiences had seen on TV. Fast, fluid, controlled. He wasn't acting out fight scenes. He was showing real martial arts. Stripped down and sharp. Filming wasn't always smooth. The production team didn't know how to capture his speed. Camera operators often asked him to slow down because the punches and kicks were too quick to register on screen. Bruce found that frustrating. He wasn't interested in slowing down for appearances. Still, the role gave him visibility. It was his first consistent job in Hollywood. The show ran for just one season, but it introduced Bruce to a larger audience, including young viewers who hadn't seen an Asian character portrayed as competent, physical, and charismatic. Behind the scenes, Bruce started training actors and athletes. He worked with Steve McQueen James Coburn, Roman Polanski, and others. They weren't just curious students. They were drawn to his presence, his clarity of thought, and his efficiency of movement. He didn't promote himself as a guru. He was selective about who he trained. His teaching focused on personal development, not performance. Still, it was Hollywood, and perception mattered. While Bruce was gaining respect in private circles, the industry as a whole wasn't sure what to do with him. He was offered roles, but they were often minor, villains, henchmen, characters without dignity. He turned most of them down. He began developing his own concepts. He wrote story outlines, character sketches, and treatments for shows that never got picked up. His most passionate project, at the time, was a series idea called The Warrior, a Western about a martial artist wandering through 19th century America. But producers were hesitant. They questioned whether American audiences would accept an Asian actor in a leading role. Bruce saw the double standard. He knew he was ready to lead. But the door stayed half open, held in place by the industry's narrow expectations. He was a dragon, visible, admired, but still kept just outside the center. Frustration settled in slowly, but it ran deep. Bruce had talent, discipline, and presence. Qualities that should have opened doors in Hollywood. Yet time and again, he was met with the same limitations. Producers hesitated to cast an Asian actor as a leading man. Scripts offered little complexity or respect. The roles weren't just small, they were narrow. Bruce tried to bridge the gap with action. He continued training celebrities. Steve McQueen, one of the biggest stars of the time, became not only a student, but a friend. James Coburn and others followed. They practiced in Bruce's backyard, where the mood was informal but focused. For Bruce, these sessions weren't about celebrity. They were about clarity. He helped each student strip away pretense and fear. Every movement, every strike, every pause had purpose. He also used these relationships to advocate for something larger. He shared his ideas for films and shows. He explained how martial arts could be cinematic, not just for spectacle, but as storytelling. But the conversations often hit the same wall. Executives questioned whether audiences would connect with an Asian lead. Some suggested casting Bruce as a supporting character, while a white actor carried the narrative. The disappointment wasn't only professional, it was personal. Bruce had come to America believing in merit, believing that skill and vision would eventually be recognized. He worked to improve his speaking voice, reducing his accent, refining his presence in front of the camera. He studied film and acting with the same intensity he gave to martial arts. But even as he improved, the parts didn't change. They remained shallow, stereotyped, or simply not there at all. Still, Bruce didn't quit. He kept writing. He filmed audition reels. He practiced lines and choreographed scenes at home. At night, he and Linda would talk about next steps. She supported him fully, but understood the toll. He wanted to provide for their growing family, and the cost of waiting was mounting. When their daughter Shannon was born in 1969, Bruce felt the pressure more keenly. 2 children, a family depending on him, a career still circling the same closed doors. And so, as Hollywood stalled, Bruce began to look back toward the boy. East, Doak. He hadn't forgotten Hong Kong. And now, it was beginning to remember him. In the stillness between projects, Bruce spent more time alone, writing, training, and thinking. His body remained strong, but his mind carried a quiet tension. He was restless, not from lack of effort, but from lack of opportunity. My dad into Sorio B. Opportunity. He reviewed his old writings, notes on movement, reflections on clarity, drawings of fight sequences, fragments of dialogue. He still believed in his vision. But belief alone wasn't opening doors. He tested new choreography with friends. Short scenes, filmed on basic cameras. Movement set against imagined tension. He was directing in miniature, building the muscle of storytelling without a full production crew. The project closest to his heart remained The Warrior. He had pitched it clearly. A martial artist roaming the American West, helping communities in quiet ways. The concept was rich, but it was passed over. A similar show, Kung Fu, was eventually produced, starring a white actor in yellowface. Bruce had once been considered for the lead. In the end, he was left out entirely. It wasn't just rejection. It was erasure. That moment marked a shift. Bruce stopped waiting. He stopped asking. If Hollywood couldn't see what he offered, then perhaps Hong Kong could. Friends from back home had reached out. His old films were being rewatched. Audiences were curious. A local studio expressed interest in giving him full control. Writing, choreographing, starring. It wasn't the path he'd expected, but it was a door. And sometimes, a door doesn't have to be open wide. It just needs to be real. In 1971, Bruce packed his things. Linda and the children would follow soon. For now, he would go alone, back to the city where he had once fought in alleyways and danced in competitions. But he was no longer the boy who had left. He was a man with purpose, a teacher with vision, a fighter with something to prove. He boarded the plane with quiet resolve, not to chase fame, not even to build a career, but to create, to shape something real with his own hands, his own words, and his own way. When Bruce arrived in Hong Kong in 1971, he stepped into a world that had changed, but not as much as he had. The city was booming. Television had grown. Local films were drawing large audiences across Asia. And the public, though uncertain at first, quickly remembered the child star who had once graced their screens. What they saw now was different. Bruce was taller, more defined, more focused. He didn't return as a former actor. He returned as a martial artist, teacher, and visionary, with something fresh to offer. Golden Harvest, a new film studio looking to challenge the dominant Shaw brothers, offered him a role in a low-budget action movie. The script was simple. A man arrives in Thailand to work at an ice factory. A series of murders. A buried secret. A final confrontation. The film would be called The Big Boss. Bruce took the lead role with quiet determination. He didn't try to reshape the entire production. Instead, he focused on what he could control: his performance, his movement, his presence on camera. What he delivered was unlike anything audiences had seen. He brought stillness to the screen. Long silences, focused glances, a controlled rhythm between dialogue and action. And when the fight scenes came, they were fast, direct, and grounded in real technique. He wasn't a performer mimicking martial arts. He was a martial artist expressing emotion through motion. The production moved quickly. The budget was tight. But Bruce handled it with calm precision. He guided the choreography, suggested camera angles, and even helped shape his character's silence, choosing restraint over monologue. When The Big Boss premiered, the response was immediate. Audiences across Hong Kong were drawn to him. And not just because he could fight, but because he carried something rare: depth, grace, and an electric presence that didn't fade when the punches stopped. The film shattered local box office records. Sauce. Pintu. Bruce, almost overnight, became a cultural icon. He had waited years for a role that felt honest. And now, in a film shot quickly on location in Thailand, he had found it. Not by forcing his way in, but by being fully himself. The success of The Big Boss changed everything. Bruce was no longer a question mark or a nostalgic return. He was a star. And not just in Hong Kong. Audiences across Southeast Asia responded to him with the kind of admiration usually reserved for long-standing legends. His next film, Fist of Fury, gave him greater creative control. This time, he had more say in how the story was shaped, how the action was choreographed, and how his character moved through the narrative. Set during the era of Japanese occupation in Shanghai, the story followed a student seeking justice for his master's death. The plot was familiar, but Bruce gave it new gravity. His portrayal was emotionally charged. Grief, pride, restraint, and rage all carried within tightly choreographed scenes. The fight sequences were longer, sharper, more intense. Bruce layered them with meaning. Each movement advanced the story. Every blow served a purpose beyond spectacle. He wasn't just winning fights. He was expressing something internal. The film became another record breaker. Fans lined up around city blocks. Martial arts schools saw a spike in enrollment. Children mimicked his stance. Adults quoted his lines. But Bruce wasn't satisfied with repetition. He didn't want to become a symbol without substance. His next move was to direct. The Way of the Dragon was his answer. He wrote the script. He shaped the humor, the pacing, and the tone. It was his vision, delivered through his own lens. He brought the story to Rome, setting the action amid ancient ruins and quiet piazzas. A Chinese martial artist protecting a restaurant from local thugs. Simple, but fresh. Bruce played with rhythm. He blended awkward moments with precision fighting. The film's most famous scene, his duel with Chuck Norris in the Colosseum, became a landmark moment. In action cinematata, it wasn't just the setting. It was the silence, the build-up, the mutual respect. It was a dance and a duel. By now, Bruce's influence had reached global scale. He received letters from Europe, South America, and the United States. Studios wanted meetings. Magazines requested interviews. But he remained focused. He wasn't chasing fame. He was building a bridge between East and West, between tradition and innovation, between physical form and inner clarity. Success, when it arrived in full, did not slow Bruce down. It deepened his focus. He now had the freedom to create on his own terms. But with that freedom came greater responsibility. Every scene, every gesture, every beat of action carried weight. He wasn't just making films. He was trying to communicate something personal, something lasting. He pushed himself harder than ever. On set, he was deeply involved in every detail, writing, directing, choreographing, even editing. Off-set, he trained relentlessly, refining his techniques, maintaining peak condition, and constantly experimenting. He took on a new project, his most ambitious yet. A film co-produced with Warner Bros., aimed not only at Asian audiences, but the Western world. The title, Enter the Dragon. For Bruce, this was more than just a film. It was a statement. He wanted to present martial arts not as exotic entertainment, but as a real, disciplined, philosophical practice. He wanted to show complexity, nuance, and authenticity. Production began in early 1973. The film combined espionage tropes with tournament-style combat. But underneath the plot, Bruce infused his principles of self-knowledge, of presence, of using no way as way. He clashed with producers over creative control. He demanded changes, rewrites, and greater input on casting. Some questioned his insistence. Others recognized it as vision. He designed every fight to tell a story. Each opponent represented a different obstacle: internal, external, or philosophical. Bruce moved through these scenes with deliberate grace, not just performing, but embodying his ideas. The filming schedule was intense. Long days, late nights, physical strain. Bruce rarely paused. He felt a window opening, and he was determined to move through it fully. At home, Linda noticed the weight he carried. He was present, but preoccupied, focused, but stretched thin. Their children still brought joy, but Bruce's mind was often on set, in the editing room, or shaping the next scene. Enter the Dragon was nearly complete by the summer of 1973. Bruce had begun promoting it, doing interviews and photo shoots, speaking about its meaning. He was tired, but proud. In quiet moments, he spoke less about stardom and more about clarity, about doing something real, about finding balance. He didn't know how the film would be received, but he had done what he came to do. He had brought his ideas to the screen, fully, honestly, and without compromise. By mid-1973, Enter the Dragon was finished. It was Bruce's most visible work to date, made with international backing and destined for global release. The early screenings were promising. Studio executives praised the film's energy, pacing, and especially Bruce's on-screen presence. There was a sense that this film would do more than entertain. It would introduce something new to the Western world. Bruce began doing press in both Hong Kong and the United States. He appeared in magazines, on talk shows, in front of cameras that now treated him with a different kind of attention. He wasn't just the martial artist anymore. He was a filmmaker, a philosopher, a cultural bridge. Despite the recognition, Bruce kept working. He reviewed dailies, checked edits, revised scripts for future projects. Ideas flowed constantly. He spoke about new stories he wanted to tell, projects with deeper meaning, more layered characters, and richer themes. But beneath that creative wave, his body was beginning to show signs of strain. There had been an earlier warning. In May of that year, while working on dubbing sessions for Enter the Dragon, Bruce collapsed. He was rushed to the hospital with severe symptoms: headache, dizziness, vomiting. Doctors diagnosed cerebral edema, a swelling of the brain. The episode passed, but Bruce didn't slow down. He chalked it up to stress, heat, maybe overwork. He adjusted his diet, rested for a few days, and then returned to his usual pace. Friends noticed he was thinner, more intense. Some said he moved, as if racing a clock only he could hear. On July 20th, 1973, Bruce was in Hong Kong, reviewing details for his next film project. He visited the apartment of actress Betty Ting Pei to go over scripts. At some point that afternoon, he complained of a headache and took a common painkiller. Not long after, he lay down to rest. The news spread quickly, first across Hong Kong, then around the world. Bruce Lee, just 32 years old, had died. In the days that followed, confusion and speculation took hold. Initial reports cited cerebral edema as the cause, an unexplained swelling of the brain, much like what he had experienced 2 months earlier. But no clear answer emerged. Some blamed medication. Others suspected underlying health conditions. A few whispered rumors. The truth was harder to pin down. His body, always a symbol of strength and precision, had faltered without warning. For those who knew him, the shock went beyond medical terms. Bruce had been disciplined in every aspect of his life: his diet, his training, his routines. He was constantly refining himself, constantly aware of every detail. His death felt like a contradiction. He had moved through life with such clarity, such control. And now, he was gone. Linda flew to Hong Kong to bring his body home. The funeral was held in Seattle, where family, friends, students, and fans gathered. Steve McQueen served as a pallbearer, as did James Coburn and other close friends. The ceremony was quiet, reverent. In Hong Kong, a second funeral drew thousands. Streets were filled with mourners, some in disbelief, others weeping openly. Newsstands carried his image on every cover. Theaters ran his films continuously. His final work, Enter the Dragon, premiered just days after his haze. Death. It became a global phenomenon. Audiences watched him on screen, unaware they were seeing him for the last time. He moved with the same focus, the same calm fire. And then the screen faded to black. Bruce had often spoken about impermanence. He believed life was about motion, never static, always flowing. His sudden death, though devastating, somehow echoed that belief. He had lived as if every moment mattered, as if every gesture carried purpose. And in the end, even his silence made a sound the world could not ignore. In the wake of Bruce's death, time moved unevenly. For his family, the loss was not a symbol. It was a presence gone from daily life. Linda returned to their quiet home, now filled with memories that no longer had a voice. Brandon, only 8, was old enough to feel the change, but too young to fully understand it. Shannon, just 4, sensed the silence in ways words could not explain. For months, the phone kept ringing. Letters arrived by the boxful. Journalists, fans, filmmakers, each wanting something. A quote, a detail, a piece of what Bruce had left behind. Linda answered carefully. She protected his legacy without turning it into a spectacle. She archived his writings, preserved his notes. She began speaking on his behalf, not with rehearsed sound bites, but with steady truth. Bruce's colleagues tried to process what had happened. Some threw themselves into new projects. Others stepped back from the industry altogether. Steve McQueen, in particular, carried the loss deeply. In the martial arts world, Bruce's absence was felt like a pause in rhythm. His teachings had been growing, changing, pointing toward a new direction. Now, there were only fragments. His students, his writings, his films. Some tried to imitate him. Others tried to define him. But none could replace the center he had held. And yet, something quiet persisted. Clubs around the world began showing his films. Young people, many of whom had never practiced martial arts, began repeating his words. Not just the dramatic ones, but the thoughtful ones. About water, about fear, about living with purpose. Universities began to cite his philosophy. Authors referenced his clarity. Athletes adopted his routines. Bruce was no longer just a figure. He had become a force. Still, for those closest to him, he remained something simpler. A father, a husband, a son. A man who rose early, trained before dawn, and spoke gently at me. Diner, but. A man who believed that truth could be found in movement, and that stillness, when chosen, could hold just as much meaning. After Bruce's passing, the world did not move on. It moved differently. His absence did not fade into quiet. It echoed, Through film, through philosophy, through the shifting energy of popular culture. Enter the Dragon became more than a movie. It became a landmark. Audiences saw in Bruce something new. A kind of grounded heroism that wasn't about size or dominance, but clarity. His movements were precise. His stillness was deliberate. The film crossed boundaries of language, class, and geography. Soon, martial arts schools opened across Europe, South America, and North America. Young people who had never set foot on a training mat began learning kicks, blocks, and stances. But more than that, they began asking questions. What was Jeet Kune Do? What did it mean to fight without fighting? What did it mean to be like water? Documentaries followed. Books were published. Writers and thinkers began referencing Bruce's ideas. Not just in martial arts journals, but in broader discussions on discipline, presence, philosophy, and creativity. In Asia, Bruce's name became shorthand for integrity. In the West, he was often called a bridge. But those terms felt too simple. He had been one man, but the ripples of his life touched countless others. For Linda, Brandon, and Shannon, life after Bruce moved in layers. Grief settled first. Then came memory. Then the slow, constant work of living forward. Linda chose not to retreat. She remained public, but thoughtful. She wrote about Bruce, not as a myth, but as a man. Honest, curious, sometimes stubborn, always striving. Her words gave depth to the image that millions had admired from afar. She preserved his archives. Notes, scribbled in margins. Letters, half-written. Training logs. Philosophy. Fragments. Over time, those papers became a library of intention, one that would guide others long after the man himself was gone. Brandon grew up in the quiet shadow of a bright legacy. He admired his father's path, but he didn't walk it blindly. He studied acting, trained in martial arts, chose roles that felt meaningful. He often said he didn't want to be the next Bruce Lee. He wanted to be the first Brandon Lee. In the early 1990s, Brandon's career began to rise. Films like Rapid Fire and The Crow showed his presence. Different from his father's, but unmistakably rooted in that same discipline and clarity. And then, in 1993, tragedy struck again. Brandon died on set, the victim of a firearm accident during filming. He was 28. For Linda, the pain returned. Different in shape, but just as sharp. She mourned her son the way she had mourned her husband. With grace, with resolve, she founded the Bruce Lee Foundation. Not as a shrine, but as a tool. To share Bruce's teachings, to support education, to help others find their own strength. Shannon, now grown, stepped forward too. She helped lead the foundation, spoke at events, and worked on preserving her father's legacy with both care and clarity. Together, they didn't just remember Bruce. They continued his motion. In the decades since his passing, Bruce Lee has remained more than a memory. His influence continues to expand, not as a wave, but as a steady current, flowing quietly through modern culture, thought, and movement. Statues have been raised in his honor, from Hong Kong's waterfront to quiet corners in Europe and the U.S. His name has appeared in classrooms, courtrooms, and community centers. His image, captured in stillness or mid-motion, hangs in gyms and homes across continents. Yet his legacy isn't built on memorabilia. It lives in practice. Every time someone steps onto a mat to train with intention, every time a student studies their breath and adjusts their posture, Every time a person chooses clarity over reaction, presence over performance, Bruce is there in principle. His writings continue to circulate. His interviews are studied not only for their philosophy, but for their tone, direct, calm, and exact. His thoughts on fear, ego, limitation, and flow have reached beyond martial arts into business, psychology, and daily life. He is remembered not just for how he moved, but for why he moved the way he did. Not to dominate, not to impress, but to understand. Bruce Lee didn't ask to be a legend. He asked to be honest. In his teaching, in his films, in his way of being. And in doing so, he became a quiet kind of flame. One that did not burn for long, but one that continues to warm the world it left behind.